I'm Jane Dunewald. I'm glad you're here with me today, and I would like to talk about the mordants that I use and what mordants are, because I use them in the botanical printing that I do, and I've been working with botanical printing on the heat press for 4 or 5 years, and in the process of that, I've drawn some conclusions about which mordants I really prefer best. Now, there's a disclaimer because lots of people do natural dyeing and botanical printing in lots of different ways. So I'm telling you what I think has worked best for me and in the classes that I teach. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to get other information and other opinions from other videos and from other instructors. Let's talk about what a mordant is. A mordant literally means, in French, that word comes from the word that means to bite. And what that translates into in our world is that the mordant is what we would soak either paper or fabric in that will facilitate the transfer of the color and the tannins and the chemicals that are applied to the plant leaves and flowers when they are sandwiched with either paper or fabric and steamed, or in my case, printed on the press. Mordants are not always, chemicals that are referred to as mordants are not always true mordants, meaning they don't necessarily facilitate and lock in the transfer of the color that I just mentioned. And so we'll get a little bit of clarity around that right now too. One of the mordants that is used most often is a food grade alum. And I have a couple of different kinds here. I have a food grade alum powder. There are lots of different kinds of alum products, and this is why it's so important to sort out which ones are best for botanical printing. There is another alum. This is actually the same thing, but with the full name, aluminum potassium sulfate. Now, aluminum potassium sulfate is sometimes just shortened to alum because it's quicker to refer to it that way. But if you're looking for a product and it doesn't have potassium or food grade in the name of the product, then you probably want to avoid it and look for one of these, because other versions of alum have they're not as pure a grade. And when they're not as pure a grade, they can have iron in them. And when they have iron or ferrous sulfate particles in the alum because it isn't a pure grade, then that can actually have a dulling effect on the color that you get in your botanical print or your natural dye. So these products are good products, and they're pretty universally used, but there's a better way to go. And the better way to go is to actually use alum acetate or aluminum acetate. Aluminum acetate is a combination of sodium acetate and aluminum potassium sulfate in equal amounts. And the fact is, in my experience and also in the reading that I've been doing, that when you mix these two together into a 50-50 mix that I call shorthand AA, but you would also see it billed as alum acetate, when you're looking for that product, you can find it online and pay big bucks for it already combined, or you can buy these two products together and then mix them and create your own alum acetate, which you can then keep in a glass bottle with a nice tight fitting cap so that it doesn't get any moisture into it, which could be problematic. The beautiful thing about the alum acetate is that it's really good for cellulose fibers, and cellulose fibers are, of course, anything that's plant-based, so ramie, linen, cotton, etc. But it also works really beautifully on silk. And so that's pretty much exclusively the mordant that is my mordant of choice at this point in my own botanical printing career. So I can use, again, either of these, the aluminum potassium sulfate or the food grade alum, mixed 50-50 with sodium acetate to make a new compound which we refer to as alum acetate. Okay, big words, stumbled a little bit, but you get the idea. Now, in the first classes that I talked about using lemon juice and even gin. And there are other people who talk about using ferrous sulfate or iron sulfate. It's also referred in that way. as mordants, or copper sulfate as a mordant. I never do. I use those to dip my plants because, as I have just said, I think that the alum acetate is the best way to go for the literal mordant. Some of the others are, lemon juice is not a mordant, okay? It is what we think of as a modifier because it can shift color. Ferrous sulfate is also a modifier because it can shift color. And notice I haven't talked about using a rust solution, and that is because rust is completely different from ferrous sulfate. Ferrous sulfate is very similar to the iron that we would take if we took iron tablets because we had an iron deficiency, but you would never drink a glass of rust water, okay? So they're two different things. And the rust water is actually, rust in general, is the process of oxidation. And so it is not necessarily good for fabric, no matter what anybody tells you. I know there are teachers using rust to make solutions to do rust dyeing on fabric or to use it in botanical printing settings. And I know that baking soda is sometimes touted as a neutralizer for rust, but in fact, baking soda is used to remove rust stains from fabric. And so isn't it interesting that when people are using a rust solution to create part of their botanical printing process, and then they're soaking it in baking soda and water later, thinking that it's neutralizing it. I suppose in a way it is neutralizing it, but what it's also doing is hopefully removing the rust, because as that oxidation continues, there is a chance that some degrading could happen to the fabric. I just think it's important to deal with what is and acknowledge that, and then we make the choices artistically of how we would like to proceed. Now, soy milk is my second favorite mordant, but it's not really a mordant either. And the way I would use this, I would mix this up 50-50, and notice, don't know whether you can actually read the container, choose plain soy milk. Doesn't have to be organic, that happens to be what my store had, but you wouldn't want vanilla or a flavored variety here. You want the plain soy milk. You could make it yourself. John Marshall is the king of knowing all of whatever there is to know about using soy products and soy milk. You can look him up, he's a genius. But in this case, all you need to know is that when you take soy milk and mix it 50-50 with water, and then you soak fabric in it for a while, could be, maybe an hour, you can leave it overnight, doesn't really matter. Although soy milk, you have to be careful because it gets kind of stinky if you leave it out for too long, okay? If it's smelling, pour it out and start over. But in any event, what soy milk does is, we think of it as a binder. It coats the surface of the fabric with a protein surface, and sometimes a protein surface takes the botanical print better than a cellulose surface. So you can experiment with soaking a cellulose or cotton piece of fabric in a soy milk solution, and you're not really creating a mordant per se, but you're creating an environment that has protein included in it so that it can print perhaps more like silk, which is a protein fiber. So those are just a few tips on what I know and think about using mordants, modifiers, and in this case, the binder. A little bit of advice about thinking through where you want to incorporate rust in your process and how to do that with the least amount of fallout over time. And if this has been interesting to you and you feel as though you've learned something, you might want to watch my heat press video here on YouTube to get a better sense of how I use the press. And I am starting a new class in September of 2022, specifically about how to use the heat press that tells you all of this and way more. You can check that out on my website. We'll put the link down below. If you've enjoyed this and you've gotten something from it, I hope you'll like it. I hope you'll ask questions. I'm happy to answer them anytime. And if you're not following me now, I hope you will subscribe. So thanks for being here. It's a delight to see you.